Hi, I'm Carolyn Freund, Dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. Welcome to this event on US H-1B visa program. I want to start with some background on why this topic is so important, why it's critical for US growth and competitiveness. And after this quick introduction, I'll introduce our esteemed speakers. So more top talent means more productivity. And US is really a nation of immigrants. It's a major part, immigration is a major part of what has made us an economic and innovation superpower. Rather than going to the talent of 330 million US citizens, we can look to the world's 8 billion people. Immigrants are risk takers. They're more likely to start businesses across countries, and this is true in the US as well. They make up 14% of the US population, but 25% of startup founders. If you look at the biggest innovators in the US, that's also true. You see people like Elon Musk, founder of Tesla and SpaceX, Sergey Brin, co-founder of Google, top CEOs as well, Sundar Pichai from Google, Satya Nadella from Microsoft. H-1B non-immigrant workers work in specialty occupations, but currently there's a cap on US workers. And the idea of the cap is that cap on the H-1Bs, the idea of the cap is that US workers could be adversely affected through unemployment or wages. But actually unemployment in H-1B sectors tends to be lower and wages are higher in these sectors. They've been capped at $65,000 a year, which is actually the same number as 1990 when the US economy was half the size it is today. California, where I'm speaking from, is the main beneficiary, as over 70% of the H-1Bs are in the high-tech sector. So let me now introduce the speakers, and just one housekeeping. If you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A. I'll be continuously monitoring it, and questions may also be answered in a written form by some of the speakers. Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi represents the 8th District of Illinois and serves on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis, and the Committee on Oversight Reform, and is chairman of its Subcommittee on Economic and Consumer Policy. And you can read his full bio online. We also have 2 professional migrants to discuss. We have Gaurav Khanna, an assistant professor here at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, and many of his current projects concentrate on education and high-skilled migration. We also have Çağlar Özdin, who's a lead economist in the Development Research Group of the World Bank, and he has written the books on immigration. He's currently co-director of the 2023 flagship report of the World Bank on international migration, the World Development Report. And he also wrote the flagship report, Moving for Prosperity, Global Migration and Labor Markets. So let me start with the Congressman. Can you please tell us about how the H-1B quota is determined, and what are the political factors that have held the number at the same level it was in 1990, despite the huge growth in the US economy? And do you see any opportunity for a change in policy in the near future? Thank you.
Well, it's great to be with you. And as I like to say, it's an honor to be someplace where they can pronounce my name properly. So thank you for having me. I have to apologize in advance. I'm going to have to duck out and cast my next vote. And hopefully I can return to the discussion. But the question is about how is the quota determined? First of all, I should just tell you that the quota right now for H-1B visas is 65,000 visas a year, with an additional 20,000 for foreign professionals who graduate with a master's degree and higher. So roughly 85,000 a year if you combine the two. It was set a very long time ago, and it hasn't changed except for a couple periods of time, namely in the 1999 to 2000 timeframe when it was increased to about 115,000 per year. And then again from 2001 through 2003, when it was actually increased to 195,000 per year during that time frame. But after that, it was lowered to 65,000 again. And the reason is politics. Unfortunately, in the Congress, it's very, very hard to increase that number because a lot of people think that you're taking jobs away from indigenous workers. But the truth of the matter is, especially now in a very, very tight labor market, there just isn't enough of a pool of folks who are willing to take those very highly technical, highly skilled jobs. And so a lot of small businesses and others go without the talent they need to do the work available and to grow their businesses. So that's the long and the short of why we have the system we have now. As for future prospects, we'll see. I and many others are trying to increase that quota, as well as increase the number of H-1B holders who can then matriculate into green card recipients. That's the other issue that I hope that you folks discuss, because there are roughly 1 million people in the queue right now to receive a green card. And unfortunately, they will be waiting a long time because our green card policies are also outdated. But I'll turn it back to you, Dean Freund, for further questions.
Maybe just one follow-up in case you have to go. During that period when it expanded, what was the pushback that pulled it back down? Do you know about how that took place and why it wasn't able to maintain at the higher level? Or was it a temporary thing that expired and there just wasn't kind of support to maintain it? Because with technology such a bigger part of the economy now than it was before, I wonder, was it due to the bursting of the 2001 bubble? What was going on then?
I think that's correct. When it went to 115,000 in 1999, obviously Y2K was on everybody's minds, that we were going to be experiencing a technological calamity unless we got the best and the brightest and the hardest working people from around the world working on this problem. And then we were, basically in the midst of this tech bubble where everybody and their mom, as long as they put a .com after their name, was going to get rich very quickly. And so we increased it to 195,000 for a couple of years, but then we had the tech bubble burst and a lot of people got laid off very fast. And I think that is what led to the reduction in H-1B visas being granted at that time. But one of the most interesting things is that class, the 1999 through 2003 classes, let's say, if you want to talk about it in terms of academics, that class of visa holders ended up being some of the most successful entrepreneurs that we've seen in America. And if you go back and look at some of the people who came over and then became green card holders, started businesses, you're going to meet a lot of people who are now household names and who inhabit places like Silicon Valley and other places in America.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great point. I forgot about Y2K because it was such a nothing burger when it finally happened. And perhaps it was partly because of immigration that it turned out to be a nothing burger, because we had all those people to help us deal with it. But that's a really important point about how successful that group is and what we're missing out by not having a group that's that size going forward. Gaurav, let me turn to you. Your research has shown that there are trickle up and trickle down effects from immigration, especially from high skilled migrants. It's not just the second sectors where immigrants enter that gain, but other sectors that are upstream or downstream might gain as well. Can you tell us a bit about that and what it's costing to limit talent?
Yeah, absolutely, Dean Fran. Yeah, so, both research by me and other researchers, looking at the consequences of this kind of high skill migration to the US, tries to understand the impacts on workers, but also, like Dean Fran said, downstream sectors and the rest of the economy more broadly, including consumers like you and me. A lot of the discussion in the media, for instance, has focused a lot on kind of native-born workers. But the research shows that there's actually a lot of nuances there. For instance, when companies hire more computer programmers or software engineers from abroad, they actually need to expand and hire more managers, HR workers, warehouse workers in other parts of the country. So kind of the growth in the IT sector raises the demand for many types of workers across the country. And so it kind of raises demand and wages and employment for US workers broadly. But I really want to kind of also talk about what the media or a lot of the other research actually doesn't focus on, which is the consequences of this kind of high skill immigration to the broader economy. A lot of these high-skilled workers are, conducting innovation in the tech sector. The H-1B workers are the forefront of this kind of tech innovation. Now, this doesn't just cause IT companies to grow, but it actually creates new technology, faster computers, better software, better phones and apps that makes our lives easier. So as consumers, we are really one of the biggest beneficiaries of this kind of high-skill immigration. So all our lives are a lot easier. We wouldn't be able to have this kind of webinar if it wasn't for kind of immigrant-led technological progress that has happened over the last few decades, right? And the important thing is this technology is now an integral input into the production processes of many downstream industries. So the healthcare sector uses software that was created by the tech sector. The car manufacturing sector uses this kind of software. So this helps create jobs and increase productivity in the healthcare sector and the car manufacturing sector, but also makes our cars better and our vaccine production faster. So there's actually some very good research by other economists, not by me, that shows that, in the 2000s, the biggest contributor to US productivity growth was actually industries that had technology as an input into their production, right? So this kind of technology has become almost like a basic infrastructure input into so many downstream sectors that this kind of immigration-led technological expansion really propped up the entire US economy, created jobs elsewhere. But this is less tangible because people don't realize that our lives are actually better because we're using better software, or our cars are actually better because someone created better software in Silicon Valley, right? It's less tangible than actually seeing the impacts on native-born workers, but it's actually the biggest contributor to kind of US economic growth over the last few decades, right? And so the benefits we kind of record are to the tune of about $50,000 per migrant. So for every new migrant, about 50,000, we're better off by about $50,000. So it's a substantial impact in many ways.
Thank you so much, Gaurav. A lot of the questions coming in are about displacement of US workers. And I'd like you all to think about that, but let me quickly turn to Chalar to talk a bit about other countries' policies and what they're doing to balance the fact that immigration is good, especially talented immigration, but there can be domestic pushback or concern about lost jobs for domestic workers. So what are the optimal policies to think about how to address that? And do you think any country has a policy that's working well?
Thanks, Carolyn, first for inviting me. And second, I want to join the Congressman for thanking, correctly pronouncing my name. So the issue is the following. We have a mindset. I mean, why high-skilled migration? It's because of skill complementarities. In this modern economy, it basically high-skilled people increase each other's productivity, right? And this is the case with the IT. This is the case in Hollywood. This is the case in academia and sports, right? This is the skill complementarities we always talk about, productivity externalities. That's why programs like the H-1B are critical. The problem is we tend to see the world through as if it's a football team with fixed number of workers, right? So if I'm going to bring Messi to Barcelona or take Messi away from Barcelona, he by definition is replacing possibly a native-born worker, right? The truth is the Barcelonas or even academic departments are like that, right? You have a fixed budget. You cannot really expand and take over UCLA or USC, right? That doesn't happen. So, but we tend to see the world from this zero-sum game, which is not correct. Vast majority of the high-skilled industries are actually widely expanding. Look at how, I mean, I had prepared some slides, but I guess we're not doing slides. If you look at the expansion of Google or Apple or Microsoft, how they go from 1,000 workers to 150,000 workers, and how the largest 20 companies in the world today by market cap are pretty much all American IT companies, is a reflection of that phenomena. So first of all, this concept that, yes, maybe, you know, in the vast majority of the high skilled worker cases, yes, there might be some marginal replacement, but the expansion of the industry compensates that many times over. Now, the fortunate thing for the US, there's also some degree of path dependence. Once you establish Hollywood, once you establish Silicon Valley or Wall Street, it attracts more high-skilled people. So it becomes really hard to replace and replicate this. That is why if any country is now trying to attract the high-skilled workers, they start with a really large disadvantage compared to the US. That is why today, 35% of the high-skilled college-educated migrants are in the United States. But not only that, they're very they're concentrated in a few select districts, counties, and even zip codes because of this, again, productivity spillover. So US has a huge, in a sense, advantage to begin with. But what happens is if we continue this path of really, I would say, ridiculously inefficient and ignorant policies, then we will enable them to catch up. Now, the countries, what the problem is with the way the H-1B visas are managed. I mean, we are trade economists by origin. We do know quotas are probably the least efficient policy instruments possible because somebody captures that quota rent, right? And that's what happens with the H-1B program. If you want to limit or manage the inflow, you need to go into tax instrument. That's number one. So certain countries are doing it like Singapore. Okay, the first best, in my opinion, is not to have a requirement, any quota or restriction at all, but some sort of an employment criteria. If you are able to find a job with, and let's put a minimum wage there, then you should be given a visa. Bhagwati had this phrase, anybody who's graduating with a degree in the United States in STEM should be given a green card along with their diploma. Right? I mean, that's, I think, the ideal thing. And if you want to continue the US dominance, especially in IT sectors, but this also expands to healthcare and education and sports, we need to remove any kind of quota to begin with and move to very dynamic tax policy instruments. So I'll stop there, Cal.
Can you explain a bit about how a tax policy would work?
So look, when you bring an immigrant worker to the United States, like me, or I think it was the case with your father and probably the congressman's parents as well, right? The main beneficiary are the employers. I mean, the migrants, other than the migrants, are the employers and the consumers of the products we produce, right, as immigrants. So you got to tax the employer or the consumer. and either you tax it, and then you use that tax to basically compensate if there are losers from the scheme. That's what we do with trade, right?
We charge the companies for the H-1B instead of a quota. We can
Exactly,
revenue.
because the way the current
Congressman, can you hear that idea? Do you think that's a potential starter in Washington to tax instead of quota?
So the idea is the following: when you bring an H-1B visa, because the demand is so big, there's a lottery, right? And certain, especially Indian outsourcing companies, are the main beneficiaries of that lottery because they oversubscribe. Instead, if you establish a tax system or even an auction, simple auction, the companies who are most willing to basically bring workers, and those tend to be the really high end, they should be paying for that privilege if that's the goal, right? To manage the inflow of the high skilled people. And I mean, I don't know any politician who wouldn't like extra tax revenue, because as it is, the gain of that limitation goes to the outsourcing companies, and most of them are foreign owned. So that's my suggestion.
Off the spots instead of quota.
Well, I think I have two observations on that. One is that people are very uncomfortable with that quota going to outsourcing companies because of abuse of the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
The concern with outsourcing companies getting that quota is essentially that they will come here. Let's just take an example of a company that comes here, takes advantage of that quota, has that person, let's say at a client site in the United States, and then they learn the job at the client site, and then it gets offshored back to another country. That entire job gets offshored back to another country, in which case I believe that would be a horrible abuse of the system, and I could not support it. The second point I would make is I really am uncomfortable with the position going to the highest bidder, because then it really cuts out the smallest businesses that really could use that talent over a large business. In other words, the theory behind the auction is that hopefully a small business, let's say it's a 5 or 10 person company, getting that one additional worker might be able to benefit a lot more than a 500 or 1,000 person company getting that additional worker and being able to deploy or utilize that person's talents. So all things being equal, I would like to expand the quota and again, prevent the abuse. I think the H-1B program actually works best when it's directed to the smallest businesses and the medium-sized businesses that are much more likely to have that worker, train that worker, retain that worker, enable that worker to set their roots in that local community, benefiting that economy, and then over time matriculate into a green card holder who will then start a business, hire locally, and enrich the local economy over time. That is really the best, in my opinion, pathway for an H-1B worker.
Yeah, I guess there's thought to think about how technical to get on this, and one could think of tariff rate quotas and all sorts of ways to make sure small businesses have access, but make sure the most valuable players also get in. But most of the questions that were coming in were really about why can't we train American workers to do this? Are they taking spots from American workers? I know that the NAACP is concerned about the state of diversity intact, and they wonder if there's more we can do to nourish domestic talent. So
can I jump in on that, Dean?
So just is limiting immigration the right tool for this? What else can we do? Go ahead, Congress.
So my pet passion in Washington is developing our nation's skills-based and vocational education system. So I and a Republican together were the authors of the law that have modernized our nation's vocational education system precisely for the purpose of training our indigenous talent to take these particular technical jobs. Just to level set everybody's understanding of our post-secondary education system currently, only 1/3 of Americans have a 4-year college degree. 2/3 do not. But for those 2/3 of Americans who do not have a 4-year college degree, their needs have largely been ignored for decades because of a desire to get Americans into college. That has been the golden ring, if you will, signifying that you have arrived in the middle class. But what we know is that if we are able to upgrade or upskill those 2/3 of Americans who don't have a 4-year college degree, who are not going to get one, we can get them into the middle class by enabling them to get the skills necessary to take those jobs which H-1B and other workers are currently filling, but which could otherwise be done by these other people. And so that's my hope, that we'll be able to expand the pool of indigenous workers to take those jobs. But in the meantime, those jobs exist unfilled. And so the choice is this, which is either we can fill those jobs by bringing people with the talents and the gumption necessary to fill them here in America, where they can set roots and enrich our economy and do all the things that Professor Khanna had mentioned, or those jobs are going to get offshore. They're just going to go elsewhere. So that is the stark choice that we have as America. And I much prefer the former. I much prefer that we have the indigenous talent to fulfill the requirements of our local businesses. But the next best transitional thing that we can do is bring people here, because the labor market is so darn tight. We have 1.7 vacancies for every worker right now in the workforce. And we gotta fill those jobs.
Yeah, and there's even more vacancies when we think about the STEM jobs where the H-1B are prevalent. But just going back to the tax idea, that tax revenue could be used to educate indigenous workers. So Gaurav, you've worked a lot on education policy as well as immigration. Do you think there are ways that those could work together?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree that we need to do a lot more to nourish domestic talent, especially, by training centers, but also by expanding the university system. But the important thing here is that it's really, I don't see it as a trade-off with more immigration. If anything, it's actually in some ways the opposite. High-skilled immigrants are actually an integral part of our training industry, our education system in many different tiers of it. For instance, a large fraction of STEM-related trainers, both at universities but also elsewhere, are high-skilled immigrants, especially in engineering and medicine, for instance. And in many ways, this has always been true, right? If you go back, like Jewish emigres during World War II had propped up the science faculty in many parts of the Northeast. Russian mathematicians did it later. And today it's like immigrants from many parts of the world. So if we really want to expand kind of training of domestic talent, we actually need people to come and help train the domestic talent from abroad. They're already doing it, but we kind of need to expand that to kind of help nourish a lot of the domestic talent that's there in the US right now.
Yeah, excellent point. So in addition to potentially using tax revenue from immigration to support education, we also use immigrants themselves. And it's true that faculty in universities do have a very high share of immigrants. I want to turn a bit to the current period with COVID and remote work, because I think one question is these are technological jobs. My son works at Amazon. He's 100% online right now. He could be doing it from anywhere in the world. So, Congressman, do you think that, and if you have to go, let us know, but do you think that remote work will change the nature of this debate? And is that being talked about in Washington?
Yes, absolutely. And I apologize. I am getting beckoned to go vote. I have to do my day job. I'm sorry. But let me, and by the way, I always joke, the one job that will never be outsourced is a member of Congress. So it's definitely, we can guarantee our own job security in that regard, except for elections. But let me just address what you said about remote work. I think that the issue with remote work that now comes up is, quite frankly, it offers an opportunity and a challenge for our workforce, our indigenous workforce, in the sense that the opportunity is that if people can get upskilled, not only can they take work here and all those jobs that are unfilled here, but they could also compete for jobs abroad that might exist that go unfilled. So that's the opportunity. The challenge is the flip side is also true, which is that if jobs are not going filled here, employers are increasingly going to try to fill those jobs from wherever they can find talent around the world through remote work. And so they don't necessarily have to offshore the job. They just have to zoom out the job. And in that sense, it really makes the job much easier for people to fill than it was before, which is all the more reason why I think we should bring people here and earn their tax revenues and have them set their roots here, invest here, and so forth. If I could just make two other observations real quick. I'm not super excited about imposing taxes on businesses here to be able to participate in attracting talent from abroad. But I am very interested in assessing fees on the immigrants themselves who might come here, because I could easily see them be willing to pay a large amount of money for the opportunity to participate and to come here into our economy and to invest in their futures. And I think the other part of it I would like to say is my dream or vision is for that to fund perhaps a fund that could then go to all Americans. That is, all Americans could find a win-win in the idea of immigration, whether it's low skilled or high skilled, because right now our incentives are not aligning as Americans with the current imperative that businesses have for wanting to have more immigrants, high skilled immigrants. I think there's a lot of resentment in our broader electorate, for that matter, across America, that only certain businesses or certain types of people benefit from immigration. And I'd like to see everybody feel like they benefit from having more immigrants. So a healthy fee or tax on incoming immigrants could really help change the equation there. So in any case, I'm so sorry. I have to go vote. And I'm so honored to be a part of this distinguished panel. And I want to say a special shout out to my brother-in-law, Prashant, Professor Bharadwaj, who was the one who connected me to this august group. And Dean, thank you so much for having me, and best wishes to all of you and all of your students.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us, and totally understand you have to get back to your day job, and we hope to have you here in person at some point in the future. Bye-bye.
And absolutely, also, I'm just going to make a pitch. We're also always looking for interns and fellows in Washington.
Yes, we have a lot at School of Global Policy and Strategy, so I'll be sending you some.
Send them our way. We love them. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'd like to turn to you on the question that, to you, Chala, on the question that the Congressman just raised about a fee on the immigrant themselves, as opposed to having, so you could have a set quota, so to make sure small businesses get it, and then have a tax that bigger businesses can pay to attract talent up to what they need and still raise revenue. Having the immigrants pay it themselves, what do you think about that? What would
well, you know, it's tax incidence doesn't matter from whom you collect it. I thought it would be much more, logical to charge the Microsofts of the world, but if they want to charge the engineers, that's perfectly fine. Whichever one is politically palatable.
I could see that being more politically palatable to say these guys are paying however much to be here, it's going to your education.
Yeah.
And basically Microsoft would just give them a bonus of that. So
Exactly, absolutely.
you're right.
Yeah.
That would be a politically feasible way of getting to the optimal policy and having more.
So, but by the way, I mean, I want to point out a couple of things. The data on the H-1B is kind of, it's not very public. But the rumors, I mean, some of the data you see, it's a handful of outsourcing companies that take 65% of the quota every year. And their workers don't stay in the US. It's not the green. They basically come here, work, and they are the ones replacing the native workers, the Americans, and then they go back home, right? Kind of like indentured servitude, actually, if you look at it, there is some literature emerging on this. So the way the H-1B visa is managed it's not just the quota itself, it's the way how it is managed and how it's allocated. The devil is in the details. And the one thing, I mean, the congressman is absolutely right, but think of it this way, around 3.5 million or 4 million Americans are entering the labor force each year. Right? So 85% H1, 85,000 people is such a small portion of it. It's a drop in the bucket. It will have no impact whatsoever in the grand scheme of things. And they're definitely not competing with the 2/3 of the people who don't have a college degree. They're not even competing with the 1/3 who have a college degree. I mean, we both have children going through the college education. We do know what high school education and college education is like in the US. The problem is you need to fix those first. Right? It's not through the cutting down the 85,000. It's not going to generate anything. And Gaurav is absolutely right. The #1 occupation in the US, where you have the largest share of immigrant workers, it's now around 70% are the engineering professors, right? And that's why we have Googles and Apples and Microsofts of the world, right? Because we not only we bring the best, but we also train the best. And most of these guys who created these technologies actually came here as graduate students, and then they stayed on. So that ecosystem should not be endangered in any way whatsoever. And then if you allow me, one thing on this remote work, it's absolutely right. It depends on the type of job. Andre's job might be done abroad easily, but not my neurosurgeons, right? It depends on the kind of job. But one thing you have to remember, especially the high-skilled people, care about the quality of life, where they live. And of the 200 plus countries in the world, probably 15 or 20 of them can compete with the US, right? So if you bring the people here, then they pay their taxes here. That's still a big plus. Maybe they will live in Colorado and work for a company in Texas, but they still want to live in the US. And more importantly, they want to raise their children in the United States, right? And the beauty of the intelligence of the American system is that your child, no matter what you are, is an American citizen. That is an amazingly appeal deal for the high-skilled. So even if this remote work, but people will still want to come live here.
Yeah, I think this point about remote work being a substitute and actually raising the quota more imperative that the congressman mentioned is an interesting point, that now it's another way to offshore, and it's much better to bring talent here. There's
Absolutely.
Innovation that happens from people talking to each other. Gaurav, do you have any thoughts about the remote work and what it means?
Yeah, I think there are some nuances here in the sense that, again, like a lot of my work is on the tech sector, as has become clear. But if you think of the tech sector, to broadly club two of the things that they do, there's coding and then there's innovation, right? And coding, we kind of always knew could be done remotely. We actually saw it with the Y2K, what happened during Y2K, where they actually did outsource a lot of the coding to other parts of the world. So the coding can happen, I think, people will realize that the coding can happen in many parts, in different parts of the world, but the innovation, at least all the research suggests the innovation requires people to be in person with face-to-face meetings. And that's kind of why there's such a high concentration of tech workers in Silicon Valley. Why aren't they in different parts of the country? Well, they kind of need to all be agglomerated in Silicon Valley in the same way the immigrant actors need to be in Hollywood, or the bankers need to be in Wall Street, or the musicians need to be in Nashville, right? The computer scientists need to be in Silicon Valley if they want to be a part of the innovation. They need to be part, and there's actually some new research that came out last week that tracks people using cell phone data in Silicon Valley and shows that a lot of great innovation actually came out of just serendipitously meeting people in coffee shops, talking to venture capitalists, things like that. So if we want the innovation to keep happening, we need people in person there. Of course, a lot of the coding may move remote, but I don't think the innovation part of the production function can kind of be moved remote in that way.
Yeah, excellent point about the importance of agglomeration and bringing people together. We're coming towards the end, so I just want to give you each a chance to say any final words, anything we've overlooked before I close. So I'll go first to Chala and then back to Gaurav and then to Stephen.
I mean, I look, what it is, I think the critical thing for any policymaker, and I wish the Congressman was still here, they have to be dynamic and adaptive. If the fact that the H-1B quota system has never changed, the world has drastically changed in 3 decades, right? It just tells you something about Washington, right? Think I mean, this is kind of when I came to the US, I came 33 years ago, and how the US has changed. And this is a fundamental component. And if it is not changing, it tells you something about how the policies are made. That concerns me more than anything. Despite all of that, I mean, the US has done remarkably well in so many ways in that 30 years. So I'm still optimistic. The one thing I'm very surprised, and it baffles, and this is what we're trying to answer in the WDR, why is the private sector, how much they lobby on the stupidest, smallest things? This is their main asset, main input. Why aren't they lobbying on this? Why aren't they more active? I don't have the answer. If I can find that answer, I mean, that's what Gaurav, we should be working on. Why isn't the Microsofts of the world lobbying more actively on this dimension?
Gaurav, final words?
I think that's a great, no, I just want us to remember that, we should be doing a lot. I think a lot of questions were about what happens to displaced workers. And I think we need to do a lot to help any workers that may be adversely affected by this program. We should be doing a lot to nourish domestic talent, to kind of grow domestic talent. But I want to make it clear that people always think of this as a zero-sum game, when actually it's really not. And the issue really is that it's very difficult to see how it's not, because it's intangible in many ways. A lot of the gains from this high-skill immigration has been to kind of grow these industries. The computer science profession was the fastest growing profession in the 1990s and early 2000s, right? It grew the industry rapidly, created a lot more jobs, and it changed all our lives in many different ways, right? We are using better software, better phones, better apps. It's completely revolutionized our lives. And people don't kind of make that relationship often, right? To see how it's really changed our lives in many different ways, right? So we shouldn't think of it necessarily as a zero-sum game. Having been said that, we need to do a lot to nourish domestic talent. A part of that can be with actually more immigrant educators. But then we should also keep in mind that, we want to protect American workers as well in many different ways. So yeah, I just want to kind of leave it at that, but I think it was a great discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, I want to thank you both. I think this has been a great discussion because I think we've talked about the optimal policy, which would be a tax, and the politically feasible policy, which might be taxing the actual immigrants. Mm-hmm. And then Gaurav, you brought in the idea of helping the affected workers and helping nourish domestic talent and using immigrants also to train workers. And all of these actually could work together in a virtuous circle if we got it right. So I think there are some additional ideas for policy that came out of this discussion. I appreciate your time today and look forward to continuing it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.